Hello and welcome to the second episode of the Chicago Dialogues. I'm Deepesh Chakrabarty, Professor of History and South Asian Language and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. I'm also currently the Faculty Director of the University of Chicago Center in Delhi. The Chicago Dialogues are being produced by the University of Chicago Center in Delhi and Prohor.in in a collaborative program over the next several months. We're very fortunate in having the well-known author, Mr. Avik Chanda, as the anchor and curator for these conversations. Today's conversation is between my esteemed colleague, Professor Muzaffar Alam, a world-renowned specialist on Mughal India, and Mr. Chanda himself. Mr. Chanda is also the author of a best-selling book on Dara Shukoh. His book has been described by Mr. Arun Shourie as the book we needed about the man we need. Welcome again. Enjoy the episode. Enjoy the series.
Thank you very much, Deepesh, and a very good evening to you viewers. Welcome to the second episode of Chicago Dialogues. Now we have this Shakespearean quotation, "The near in blood, the nearer bloody." And as we know, history is replete with the unfulfilled promise of princes who've been cut down in their prime. And the Mughal Empire is no exception. This particular episode traces the life and times of the Crown Prince, Muhammad Dara Shukoh, his prodigious talent as a chronicler, poet, philosopher, connoisseur of the arts. We bring into focus his deeply syncretic ideas and the bitter rivalry with his brothers, which resulted in an open war of succession, leading to his tragic end. And to bring Dara Shukoh to life, we have with us Professor Muzaffar Alam. While Professor Alam is no stranger to the viewers of this program, a few words about this remarkable scholar would be apposite. Dr. Alam is the George V. Bobrinskoy Professor, South Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. Having been trained at Jamia Millia Islamia and then Aligarh Muslim University and finally JNU, he taught for 3 decades at the Center for Historical Studies at JNU and held visiting positions in a number of European and American universities. A specialist in Persian, Arabic, Hindi, and Urdu, Professor Alam is one of the world's leading historians of medieval and Mughal India. He also has a strong interest in philology, literature, and text studies. His major publications include The Crisis of Empire in Mughal North India and The Languages of Political Islam in India, 1200 to 1800. Amongst the book that he has jointly authored are A European Experience of the Mughal Orient with Seema Alavi, and in collaboration with Sanjay Subramaniam, The Mughal State, 1526 to 1750, Writing the Mughal World, and Indo-Persian Travels in the Age of Discovery, 1400 to 1800. Professor Alam, a very, very warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much. It is my privilege that you have asked me to participate in the Chicago Dialogues series. I'm thankful to my friend and colleague Deepesh Chakrabarty as well. Even he used one word, but it was very generous. and for your kind and generous introduction. I'm just an ordinary student of history and a bit of course, language, which of course you can use the expression philology, because philology, which philology, old philology, new philology. Yes, so I'm honored. And of course, it will be my pleasure to respond to whatever questions that you have.
Okay.
And also,
Now, Professor Alam, when we were talking earlier amongst ourselves, one thing that really struck me was the formative years in your education, or if you call it the Ibtidai Talim, right? Which is very, very unusual, quite unique. And I think it'll be great for our viewers if you could recount those early years.
yes, in fact, my early education was in Maktab and Madrasa, Muslim Maktab and Madrasa, because my father was a Maulvi, my grandfather was a Maulvi, and several members in my family was Maulvis, Maulanas and Maulvis. So, in keeping with the tradition of the family, my father decided that I should go first to get Islamic education, Dini education, religious education. And I, of course, gained a lot by having been there, especially today when I feel that I'm working on pre modern times, and where, in fact, my training in the language, particularly Arabic and Persian, in fact, helps me a great deal. So that way, and also, even if a bit of course, theology, I include, of course, theology, scholasticism, dogmatics, ilm kalam, as it's called, and or ilm fiqh, the jurisprudence. But more than that, also my interest in Islamic history in my own way. Of course, I got a particular perspective from my teachers, which I could not stay with in later times. But I did get, in fact, an idea of Islamic history, particularly early Islamic history, Prophet's times, Prophet's companions' time, and Prophet's companions' time, the early Islamic history. So these were the advantages, but there were also, in fact, losses. I felt later when I meet my friends that I am deprived of many of the things which perhaps would have helped me in my understanding of even philology, let alone history. There have been, in fact, so much, in fact, besides, of course, the question of evidence and interpretations, so many things, in fact, in history. So that I miss. Yeah, so this is what.
Right. And as a historian, your work as an academic, you started off by focusing on political economy, but thereafter, this focus, I wouldn't say shifted, but it broadened. The canvas completely broadened and it encompassed theology, statecraft, philology, language itself. So tell us about that process in the
Yeah,
evolution of your thought.
good question. Yeah. Yes. So, in fact, uh, I was influenced as a student in Aligarh University. My master's and MPhil are from Aligarh. My as I graduation BA is from Jamia Millia. So I was influenced by some of my best teachers there, who had worked on economic history of Mughal India, or rather agrarian history of Mughal India. I'm referring to Irfan Habib's great book, Agrarian
Yes.
History. So I thought that I should, in fact, write something along those lines, and in particular in the post-Aurangzeb period. So that was a kind of political economy. But then I realized because the time also changed, and the historiography also, the focus on history changed from late 70s, uh, you know, onward. So I realized that, even if I have, of course, the advantage of looking at the documents more closely, I would not say correctly. You can always, commit errors, but more closely and meticulously. But why should I use my knowledge of the language only to read the revenue documents and revenue records? So I should read also something which have a reflection on the culture, living styles, and relationship, human relationship, religious culture, etc., and also the literary cultures. So these two things together, my own, in fact, dissatisfaction with the use of whatever little that I had acquired, and also, in fact, the changes. And amongst, in fact, as I can, if uh, considering the time, I should not, for instance, the great book, in fact, emerged during the same time, by Ronajit Guha, with reference to India,
Yeah.
this elementary aspects of peasantry uprisings. But in fact, in course of time, I've noticed that many of his close friends, including my colleague and friend Dipesh, they would write more on. It started with, of course, a kind of economic history,
Mm-hmm.
in, but it's moved to culture, religion, and the questions of course, everyday life. So this is one. And then, of course, I came uh, to in 2001. I moved to Chicago, and here, of course, I met my friends, and I was asked to teach the language Persian, also advanced Urdu, and several other philological texts which I read. And when you read the text, and when I realized that perhaps many of the things that I have derived from my earlier cursory sort of reading now are different. So
Mm-hmm.
between the lines, etc. So the results, of course, you saw that in 90s I published on literature, Persian language and literature, and also, in fact, I know something on Sufism, and on statecraft, as you say, the norms of governance, ethics, that is Nasirian ethics, and which, of course, I combined in my lecture, Devashkar Memorial Lecture in Kolkata in 1996, where I was invited. And that, in fact, gets a better, in fact, expression in my book, Languages of Political Islam. Yeah, please.
Speaking about that particular book, Languages of Political Islam, to what extent would you say it derived from that early process, that early education? Because going back to the time of the madrasa, I remember you telling me you were not only studying the Quran, the surahs, and the hadiths. There were times where you would actually challenge, intellectually, you will challenge your teachers, and the interpretation that they expound, right, would be different from what you realize. So I'm trying to get a feel of how that would have shaped this particular book.
Yeah, in fact, my training in history combined with my earlier training in madrasa combined, in fact, enabled me to interrogate some of the things which I had read, not simply from my madrasa teachers, the written by madrasa teachers, but also from my university professors. My training in history, for instance, in Aligarh, it was focused that, the Islam that you have in India was not the same Islam, the Arabic Islam. But it was not, in fact, focused much. I realized that, Abak or Iltutmish are not Islamic names. And even many of the names which are considered to be Muslims today in India, they are not
Mhm.
Islamic names. Parveen, Shaheen, Parvez, Khusro. So I thought that perhaps if Islam could be, quote unquote, Persianized or Turkified after it left the confines of Hijaz, Makkah and Medina, why not Islam could be also Indianized? But unfortunately, I didn't have expertise of examining the non-Persian Indic sources. Otherwise, perhaps it's a major lacuna in this book where I, in fact, ask questions, but my response, my answer is not complete, not satisfactory to my own self. So these are some of the questions which, in fact, agitated me, and which I had in mind when I started, in fact, or started developing the argument for this book. Of course, it is in continuations of my whatever I had read and I had written in the 90s earlier. It was published, of course, 2004. When I was, yes, and in when I moved here, besides, of course, my experience and learning from experience with my colleagues, learning from my students, something happened. That was 9/11, and that 9/11 also, in fact, jerk, gave me a jerk, shocked me. And I thought that perhaps uh, Islamic history or the experience of people in the past of Islam has to be, in fact, presented with reference to India in a different way, so that this kind of misunderstanding should be. So that was my.
So, Professor Alam, we now come to the main focus, the main subject of today's discussion, which is Dara Shukoh, the high noon of the Mughal Empire with Bacha Shah Jahan and Dara Shukoh and his brothers, and how that entire drama unfolds. But before talking about Dara Shukoh, I think it would be very interesting for our viewers if you could lay out, if you could paint a picture of the imperial household. What was it like for a prince of the Mughal Empire to grow up back in the day? What was it like for Dara Shukoh in his formative years?
Yes, actually, what happened in Shah Jahan's time, or what happened to Dara Shukoh, or Aurangzeb, was not something unexpected, I would say, if we have a rough idea of what were the basics of the Mughal norms of governance and Mughal statecraft. You know, the sovereignty in Timurid tradition was not exclusive for the Badshah, of course. When the king is on the throne, of course, he is the exclusive king in practical terms. But, his immediate male sons, it is shared by all male sons.
Mhm.
So there was no fixed law or fixed principles of primogeniture, that who would succeed the reigning monarch, the reigning Basha. Thus, the expectations would be on the part of the princes that they should have all equal opportunity to grow, to be tutored, to be
Mhm.
trained. The masters or the tutors which the Basha would select should be of the same, if not the same, of similar, in fact, metals, similar qualities. And the households that they would build after they are, about 10 or 12, also should have the same facilities in terms of money provided by the imperial coffer, the royal coffer. So this was, in fact, the expectations. But what happened that practically throughout the history, this norm was violated by almost everybody, even Babur.
Mhm.
I start from India, even Babur. Babur, that he had particular love and affection for Humayun. Of course, and Humayun, of course, succeeded him. And then
Yes.
Humayun, if we have read or if you browse through Kanun-e Humayuni, Humayun had his own vision of power, his own vision of kingship, to the extent, in fact, my understanding that he was not defeated by Sher Shah because he was there, in the battlefield, and he was, in fact, Sher Shah was much ahead of him. Of course, he could have been, and he had much better training. He had also local connections in the Battle of Chausa. But much earlier, in Bengal, Humayun had a darbar, a court, and it is reported that when Humayun came to the court, everybody should, in fact, raise the slogan, "Behold, the sun is out." Now, this thing, of course, would not be welcomed by his brother, Mirza Hindal or Mirza Askari, let alone Mirza Kamran.
Kamran.
So you have, in fact, after he moves out of Bengal, and of course he stayed, Humayun is also very fond of good weather, good food, and opium. So, and he enjoyed Bengal rainy season. So he was late also, in fact, to return, and he suffered. I mean, I should not go into the details. And there he did not get, in fact, good support of his brothers. Uh, you know, uh, the conversation that he had with Mirza Askari after his defeat when he arrives Delhi. So this is second violation. Now come to Akbar's time. He is in fact the cleverest, the shrewdest, and the best, and the builder of the Mughal Empire. But you see that after his power gets a kind of stability, he wants to in fact deal with his half brother Mirza Hakim. He does not, even if he has more or less unshared ruling, unshared control over the kingdom of northern India, Indo-Ganges, and also whatever the extension that had taken by the late 70s, 1570s. But he is not, in fact, he always consider him a threat. And one of the major things that he decides, whatever the reason, one explanation could be that Mirza Hakim is under the influence of Naqshbandi and Dara Shukoh Akbar, for some reasons, having lived in India, and having dealt with, in fact, Indian communities, he thought that the understanding that Naqshbandi had could not be, in fact, implemented, really understanding of religion in Indian context. But, the fact is that he would not tolerate Mirza Hakim. And so that is one. And after he has literally demolished Mirza Hakim, and he has exclusive control over northwest frontiers. Now, when his own time comes to decide and to give opportunity to his sons and grandsons and the princes, what he does, he ignores the principle, and he shows preferences for Jahangir's son, Prince Khusro.
For his grandson, yes.
For his grandson. And that the result was Jahangir's rebellion. And of course, Jahangir is forgiven, and then Jahangir comes to the throne. But, this is significant, that how it is that Jahangir managed to get support from the nobility, because the nobility is aware of the Timurid tradition. They knew that this was, despite their, of course, immense regard for Akbar, they, particularly Murtaza Khan, Sheikh Farid Bukhari, and even Mirza Koka, even if he was not, or the Rajput Rajas. So I think that, this is the violation, second violation, major violation. And Jahangir himself, Jahangir had suffered. But then at one stage, he in fact favored one of his sons, Prince Khurram, and called him Shah-e-Jahan, the king of the world. He is still prince, and he calls him, he himself is the conqueror of the world, and his son is now Shah-e-Jahan, the king of the world. This was absolute violation, and this would have offended, Prince Parvez, or even Prince Shahriyar. By that time, Shahriyar was nothing.
Yes.
Or, in fact, Mirza or Khusro. But Khusro, he blinded Khusro. When he came to power, he did not trust Khusro. He blinded him. And you know that when Prince Khurram is favored, and he showed, of course, his abilities to be the real, of course, successor of Jahangir. And,
both in the campaign, right?
March of Deccan, one of the conditions that he
Khusro has to go with him on his campaign.
Khusro had to go with him. And then that mysteriously Khusro died.
He comes back, but Khusro doesn't come back.
So Shah Jahan, despite Prince Khurram, despite the fact that he is the favored son of his father and he is Shah Jahan, but he does not, trust the blinded, brother, of course, brother.
Professor Alam, if we come to Dara Shukoh, would it be fair to say that from an early age itself, there was quite a bit of partiality? Of course, his mother, Mumtaz Mahal, died young, but we have evidence to show that he was definitely the beloved of his mother, and certainly his father, vis-a-vis many of the other children, particularly the other three brothers.
Yes, in fact, there is no doubt about it. One, let us not forget that Dara is for some other reasons, pure emotional human reasons. Dara is the beloved son of his father and mother, because Dara was, before Dara, no male child would survive, and he came as a barakat of as a grace of, as a dua of Khwaja Moinuddin Chishti. So, all this, and he was the eldest son and he survived. So that could be. But, his mother, he is also beloved of his mother. And it is not just a coincidence. So it could be coincidence that his mother, of course, unfortunately died, within 3 years of Shah Jahan's coming to power. Shah Jahan came to power, of course, literally in November 2000 or 1627, but practically from 1628. And Mumtaz Mahal died in Burhanpur during the very first campaigns of Shah Jahan in 1631. And at the time of death, in fact, of course, Jahanara is with, because Mumtaz Mahal died of childbirth. But after the death, where he was buried, of course, Shah Jahan had decided that she would not stay there and she would have a much better, in fact, mausoleum somewhere else in the capital. But whenever Shah Jahan, it is reported that whenever Shah Jahan would go, I have no, in fact, details of if Shuja and Aurangzeb were also there, but whenever Shah Jahan would go, would pay homage to the grave of his wife, Dara Shukoh would be with him.
Would be there with him.
So this is, of course, one of the, I mentioned this for the reason, emotional reason. Yes, so Dara is, of course, the most favorite. Even if you take his marriage, wedding, in fact, one of the most, in fact, the most expensive wedding in Mughal India,
Yes.
that 1632. And then, of course, Dara Shukoh's, mansab. If you have Dara Shukoh's mansab, Dara Shukoh was given, and Dara Shukoh, of course, was allowed to stay in the royal palace with his father and with all the luxuries of the palace. And Dara Shukoh, the mansab that he was given was 60,000 zat and 40,000 savar, 30,000 du aspa si espa.
Yes.
The question, and compared his mansab, Zat mansab, with Shuja and Aurangzeb. Shuja had 20,000, Aurangzeb has 20,000, Dara Shukoh had 60,000.
60,000.
Poor Murad had only 15,000, with Dara Shukoh's eldest son Suleiman Shukoh had. Now, the second thing is, this is in fact a very interesting, and this must have in fact offended Aurangzeb, that Dara Shukoh was, of course, he was given governorship. I'll come to this point. It's not that he did not have governorship. He had the governorship of Allahabad. He had the governorship of Gujarat. But he was also allowed to rule by deputies. He would not go to. Of course, he visited Allahabad, but he visited Allahabad to meet the Pandits in order to learn Sanskrit. So and 3,000.
So to an extent, it would be fair to say, right, Professor Alam, that he ruled almost like proxy, because he has the viceroyship, the governorship of so many different provinces, including the Punjab, but he did not spend much time there.
Yes. Yeah.
And this 60,000 people, 60,000 zat, is for a prince who has never been on a campaign until that point.
And unprecedented in the entire Mughal history, unprecedented. And even in the later times, you did not have 60,000 zat. So that is, and that of course only Shah Jahan could have afforded, because Shah Jahan's empire is not an ordinary empire. It's one of the richest, in fact, the richest empire
in the world.
Regime, yes. At the time. And in Mughal India, of course. So I think that this is something which we there is no doubt that, but we should in fact also consider the advantages that accrued to Dara because of his living most of the time with his father and in Agra or Delhi, or the disadvantages. And also the advantage is that he had ample time to think. And he was not ruined. That's also, in fact, the great character, showed the character of. He was not ruined. He did not become debauched. He did not become addicted to drinking.
To opiates or wine or anything like that. Yes, indeed.
He must have drunk, because there are references in some of the ulama's texts that he also drank sharab. So
yes.
Wine. But of course, he is not addicted to drink. He is, so that is, of course, the advantage. And he developed the love and passion for books. and he built this library, which will come, of course, later. Yes. So these are some of the things, but he did not have the experience of administration. Experience of administration, of course, from the court, from the capital, he did have the experience of ruling. In fact, virtually, and I'll come to this question later if there are any questions. Virtually, he is the king. He is the king because his interference in several, in fact, Shah Jahani decisions became very effective. He changed the decisions of the Basha and he became virtually the Basha. And this also, in fact, caused, inconvenience and offense to his
Yes.
brothers, especially
Yes.
Aurangzeb, who thought that he is the best. And he is the best, of course. He proved to be the best, of course. History proved him to be the best in the sense that he succeeded. Yeah.
Professor Alam, there's this very sharp contrast that we see. So, on the one hand, he is in the seat of power, he's in the midst of this immense, almost unimaginable kind of luxury and opulence. And at the same time, most of his predilections, most of his sort of mental aptitude is towards philosophical moorings. He becomes a Qadiri and he meets Miyamir and then he meets Mullah Shah. Uh, Tell us about those associations and those meetings in particular.
Yes. In fact, as I told you that, he had, of course, he benefited from these luxuries in the palace, but he was not ruined. Dara Shukoh, if you read his, in fact, the books that he have written all the time, he is very conscious of the fact that he has something to do with the esoteric aspect or this significant aspect, tasawwuf or Sufism.
Mhm, mhm.
He remembered all the time that he came to this world and he appreciated. He mentions, and his sister particularly when he, because simultaneously both brother and sister Janara compiled this hagiographical account. Sisters is Munisul. I'll come to that one later. So Dara Shukoh remembers that he is in this world and he is flourishing because of the dua, because of the prayers, because of the barakat, because of the grace of Khwaja Moinuddin Chishti. And Khwaja Moinuddin Chishti is a Sufi. He is, of course, the founder of the Chishti order in India.
Silsila. Yes.
So he in fact he uses this time to read books on tasawwuf, besides, of course, about the life of the Prophet, life of the companions, but primarily the books of tasawwuf. And he is very much fascinated by some of the earlier hagiographical accounts of or dictionaries of the Sufis, in particular Jami. Abdur Rahman Jami's Nafhatul Uns, which is, of course, a hagiographical account. He's very much impressed. He's impressed also because Jami is from Herat. And Herat on Jami has close connections with the Timurid prince in Herat. He has connections with the Timurid, lines of Timurid dynasty. So this also could be the reason. And he is a poet. Jami is also a poet. So in fact, so therefore, before he comes into contact with Miyamir, and that is, of course, through his father, and that is because in Lahore, that is because, after the death of one of his, in fact, children, he
Yes.
felt depressed. And father thought that he should take him because around the same time there was a reputation of Miyamir. So father, in fact, took him to Lahore for cure, for his treatment. And you know that Miyamir, in fact, took a ball full of water and breathed into it, and he gave him to drink, and he drank, and he said that within a week he felt that he's perfectly all right. And also a new world, in fact, a world much beyond this world. Also, he felt
Appears
in,
before him.
yes, and then of course he paid visit to Myanmar again, and I would not go into the details. In fact, the kind of the humility and that he showed to Myanmar, and Myanmar, of course, in fact, the affection and love that he showed, and so after that, of course, he felt that he is in a man of a different world, But unfortunately, he could not get initiated into the order, even if he had intended, but he could not because Mian Mir died in 1635. Dara Shukoh met him in 1634. And Dara Shukoh then, of course, came close to Mian Mir's one of the best disciples, Mullah Shah Badakhshi, and he became Murid of Mullah Shah Badakhshi in 1639. And around the same time, he had started writing, of course, on Sufism and the entire 40s, four books that he wrote on Sufism. And then he moved to the questions of Indic traditions and Islamic traditions. So this is how I would respond to your question. Dara Shukoh, by temperament, he had inclination towards tasawwuf, and it so happened the immediate reason could be that he felt depressed and he was introduced to Mian Mir, and otherwise he could have been Chishti like his sister, and he could have been Chishti and Qadri. In fact, Chishti, Jahanara claimed that he's a Chishti. Even when she died, she said that she's a Chishti, but she was in fact attracted to Qadri, and she said that it was initially because of his brother. So he could have been a Chishti, but he became a Qadri, and that was in fact, I would say, coincidence. But that coincidence, that is the expression, manifestation of his tasawwuf through, in fact, Qadri Silsila. Otherwise, he is, I would not say by birth. He seems to be, of course, by birth, because his birth is because of the grace of Muhyiddin Chishti. That is how I...
In Ajmer, yes, indeed. Professor Alam, let's now turn to the unfolding dynamics throughout the 1640s and the early 1650s between Dara Shukoh and his brothers. Because as you said, right, in terms of the traditional Timurid scheme of things, any person, any prince of the royal blood would be entitled to the throne. So in this particular case, there is Dara Shukoh, there is Murad Baksh, Shah Shuja, and of course Aurangzeb. But as the years go, one gets the feeling that the main rivalry and the bitterness of the rivalry, the absolute acrimoniousness of the rivalry, is mainly between Dara Shukoh and Aurangzeb. They're like counterpoints in the entire sort of empire. What are your thoughts on that?
So just immediate response to this question, main rivalry. The reason is that amongst the brothers, amongst the other three brothers, Aurangzeb thought that he is the best and the most suited to take care of the empire after his father. And later on also, Aurangzeb cited in one of his letters what his father Shah Jahan thought of him and Dara Shukoh and the other two brothers. And that shows, in fact, so he in fact, he says that he was in love. Dara Shukoh says that I love my, of course, Mahin Pura Khalafat, that's the eldest son. But unfortunately, he is very fond of making enemy the best of the, supports, that nobles. Aduwe Nikukaran, those who were really, in fact, helpful for building and sustaining and consolidating the empire, they all have turned enemies, not simply indifferent enemies. And Shah Shuja, of course, he is in Bengal. He is very happy there. He eats well. He is enjoying Bengal scene, etc. But Murad Baksh, he is good for nothing because he is very fond of. He has become drunkard. And Aurangzeb could have, Aurangzeb himself. So it has to be, in fact, accepted with a sort of pinch. Aurangzeb, he says that he was, in fact, whatever the requirement of the empire or the state is, management is, he was the best. But unfortunately, he is very fond of rakakat. Rakakat in Urdu means the low mentality. This is from, this one meaning of rakakat means, in fact, the best meaning of rakakat would be that the person who looks very meticulously and closely into everything. And his rakakat, you can see that his rakakat comes out even when he is the Badshah, when he is the king. Rakakat with reference to his father, rakakat with reference to his own son, Muhammad Sultan, rakakat with reference to his another son, Muhammad Akbar, and rakakat with reference to his daughter, the greatest of her time, Zibun Nisa. So the rakakat. But of course, Aurangzeb himself mentioned that father, thought that he suffers from rakakat. And that rakakat, of course, means that he looks into everything. So therefore, he is the most, in fact, sensitive to whatever is happening, there in Agra. And he thinks that despite the fact that he is so much in love with his father, he sends every year, in fact, from Aurangabad, the mangoes, mangoes from Aurangabad. And and he is trying to expand the empire. The father, when he was in Deccan, wherever he failed, he wants now to, in fact, subjugate and finalize, the deals with the Bijapur and Golconda. And my brother, he is, in fact, all the time, he doesn't want me to be successful. And this comes out very clearly from, in fact, 27 or 28 letters that he wrote to Jahanara. He had trust, of course, in Jahanara. Each letter, in fact, is virtually, in fact, a protest and crying for whatever. And finally, in fact, Aurangzeb is so tired of that within a period of, Aurangzeb was sent to the Deccan in 1636. In 1644-45, he comes back from the Deccan without being recalled. And he, in fact, gives the impression that he doesn't want, in fact, to be away from the court. But of course, he was not lucky to be there in the court because he was not trusted, even perhaps, quote unquote, I should not say this, by his father. So his father sent him to Gujarat. And in Gujarat, whatever he did, in Gujarat, he's dealing with Shantidas Jain and the demolition of the temple in Gujarat, of the Jain temple. And also, in fact, much more than that, his hatred against the Shias, particularly the Bohra Shias. He executed the Bohra Imam, Bohra Dai, of course it's technically Dai, Qutbuddin, and he became very close to Qazi Abdul Wahab of Gujarat, and also, I think, who was Sadr, Mullah Abdul Qawi. So this is what he gained. So now, after he returns from the capital to his new appointments, from Gujarat, of course, he's recalled to lead the campaign to the northwest frontier. But then he started building the alliances not simply amongst the ulama and I would not say Sufi, the ulama and the scholars, theologians, but also amongst the nobles, which will come, of course, later. In fact, he won over even Jaswant Singh and Raja Jai Singh, Rana of Mewar. So this is, in fact, but more than that, perhaps, when we think of the problems between Aurangzeb, because Shuja does not represent any particular intellectual, tradition of the time, or for that matter, Murad Bakhsh, of course, Murad Bakhsh could have become a Shia. He had his own understanding of Islam, but this is, of course, the matter of details and also not very clear and undisputed. But Aurangzeb has a particular approach to Islam and to the state, to Mughal state. What should be the Mughal state like? What is the particular, in fact, and the most correct and the perfect manifestation of Islam? He is a jurist. Practically, he's a jurist. And right from the beginning, you have, in fact, his problems with the notion of millenarianism, with which, in fact, the Mughal Empire is associated. And he doesn't want this. Of course, later on, he became a millenarian from the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi point of view. That millenarian, if there is anybody who is the renovator of the culture and Islam for 1,000 years to come, it would be, of course, Sheikh Ahmad Sarandi Mujaddid Al-Afsani. And I won't go into the details, the kind of the relationship that he had with the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi Sarandi Center, where he also, in fact, went for particular training of the famous Hadith Bukhari with one of the Mujaddidi, and where he was, in fact, he did not attend his father's funeral, which of course hurt Jahanara so much. He
Very
thought
much.
that he will be there, but his suspicion is that he was at that time in Syria. So, in fact, this approach, the two different approaches.
Professor Alam, we come to the 1650s, and earlier in the program, you had outlined the fact that breaking with Timurid tradition, Jahangir had in fact announced his favorite son, the Crown Prince Baba Khurram, as the Shah Jahan. But Shah Jahan goes several steps further. There is almost a near coronation. There's a darbar, and he removes the ornaments and the serpage from his own person,
Yes.
and adorns Dara Shukoh and confers on him the title of Shahi Buland Iqbal, which is unprecedented. And correct me if I'm wrong, neither before this nor after this in the entire Mughal Sultanate do we see something like this.
Words, yes, but virtually even Khusro was Wali Ahad or heir apparent. And of course, Jahangir did not. But Jahangir later, in fact, under the influence of Nur Jahan, wanted Shahriyar, of course, but which did not succeed because Asaf Khan was there to support, in support of. Yes. So, Shah Buland Iqbal. I don't think that Shah Buland Iqbal is something, in fact, but this must have offended, particularly Aurangzeb. There is no doubt about it. And Wali Ahad, in fact, all the chroniclers, in fact, interpret this word Shah Buland Iqbal as Wali Ahad, that is, he has been declared. And in fact, some of the Europeans, in fact, give you the impression that when they would visit the court, they would see two thrones, in fact, the son and father sitting next to each other. Yes, so this is true, but all this also, in fact, led Aurangzeb to be more diplomatically and astutely building the alliances with the nobles, which of course manifested during the time of the War of Succession.
And Professor Alam, this is the strangest thing. At a time where there is festering tension across the empire, there is bitter rivalry, and there is no reason why Dara Shukoh would not have felt that rivalry. In particular, there is Aurangzeb, who is building all of these alliances, including those with some of the Rajput Rajas. And there is Dara Shukoh, who is retreating inwards into his soul. It's almost as if Aurangzeb is looking at an external empire and Dara Shukoh is looking at an internal empire, because he is looking at the translation of Yoga Vashisht. He is looking at Majma al-Bahrain. He is looking at Sirah Akbar, which is, you can't have a bigger contrast.
Yes, that is, in fact, internal empire. In fact, Dara Shukoh's, of course, it's today, of course, from hindsight, you can say that he failed, and therefore my reading would not be acceptable. Dara Shukoh thought that, first, the internal empire had to be, in fact, corrected. What should be the soul of Mughal empire? And he was more concerned about that. And I think that, right from, of course, his 40s, his concern with Sufism and quote unquote tall claims about his own self. He would have different voices from the world beyond about his own position. So he is established Sufi, a spiritual person. He believes that he is now a spiritual person. And in the 50s, early 50s, you see him first, of course, Marad al-Bahrain, or Majma al-Bahrain, and where, of course, general reading about Islam and Hindu traditions, and seeing the similarities and resemblance, and then, of course, translations. And his translation, particularly Yoga Vasishta, despite the fact that there had been earlier 3 almost complete full translations, but he is not satisfied with translation. And then finally, of course, Sirah Akbar, that is Upanishad 51 shloks translations. Now, I would particularly, in fact, give request your attention to the translation of Yoga Vasishta. Yoga Vasishta, in fact, it's a book on Vedanta, and therefore he is a Sufi. He is a Vahdatul Wujudi Sufi, unity of being. So he sees, of course, similarities, and he is fascinated, and he wants to translate. But what is important that before he translates, he mentions a dream, and that dream is very important. What is the dream? He sees, in fact, Vashisht Muni, the master of, the teacher of quote unquote, I'm using it for general terms, of Ramchandra, who gives, in fact, the speeches in Yoga Vasishtha. And he sees a young man, and then of course Vasishtha Muni introduces him to this young man. He says that Ram, he is your younger brother, give him a sweet meat. So that is something very important. It's not simply to, he is now a little ahead of this old Sufism. He is now also, in fact, looking for something similar or locating something in the Indic traditions. And he is, in fact, on a par with, he is talking to Vasishtha Muni, and then, of course, he translates. He invites the Brahmins, and he gives a new translation. And the new translation begins with the major story between Vasishtha Muni, the fight or the competition between Vasishtha Muni and the major I forget. I mean, of course, who is a Kshatriya, but he became, of course, the major, Muni, and this story of this famous, cow, of course. So, forget, that's not very important. But he thinks that this Yoga Vasishtha is not simply a book of Vedanta. Yoga Vasishtha is a book on the principles of governance. Who should be the ruler? Aurangzeb is preparing himself to become ruler, and he is, in fact, he has the external facets of the empire, and he wants to control the nobles, etc. He goes view is somewhere else. He wants, in fact, to build the basis of the empire, consolidate the base. What should be the Mughal empire like? And in this connections, I would like to in fact give you a brief, my understanding that Yoga Vasishtha comprises, as we know, a conversation between Vasishtha Muni and God Rama. And Dara Shukoh reads this text not simply as a book on Vedanta, but saw Rama as an ideal king through whom he visualized his own future. He has attained the highest stage in Tasawwuf. So he is also highly spiritualized person. So as Rama, after having the stature of God, is the ideal ruler, so it is only he who could be the ideal ruler. This is the message that he wants to communicate, but unfortunately the people are behind. He is much ahead of the time, and he does not, in fact, take care into so that the Mughals right from the beginning were very keen to have the ideals of the kingship and norms of governance beyond the narrow confines of Sharia. Nasirian ethics in Babur, and then, of course, its best manifestation in Akbar's time. Then you have in Jahangir's interest in through this Jerome Xavier to understand, the European, in fact, understanding of European norms of governance. And we have an Adab-e-Sultanat in Persian, which he translated from and presented to Jahangir. And then even Dawar Bakhsh, that is Prince Khusro's son, who is known as also as Mirza Bulaqi or Murad Bakhsh, he showed interest in the ancient Sassanid times. Now you have, in fact, so there is, in fact, an urge, a curiosity to know the norms of governance in other traditions, other than, the traditions beyond the Islamic. But few of them went as far as Dara Shukoh, who showed persistent interest in knowing what Indic theories of kingship were and how they could serve as a model to be followed in Mughal India. Such an effort was quite unprecedented, since even Akbar did not go so far as to see Mahabharata as a model for Mughal political governance. He was curious about it. He made an attempt to understand it, but he never wanted to follow it. Dara Shukoh's interest in Rama's career was also because he wanted to show how a man of God, as he saw his own self, would also be an ideal ruler. So he is also preparing. So this is what my understanding.
I think it would be very interesting for our viewers if you could share one or two couplets that Dara Shukoh had written, because this is also the time when he comes into his own as a poet.
Yes, in fact, towards the end of the 40s, he began to be known as a poet, and he acquires this poetic name Qadri, because he is a Qadri, and he is very much inspired by his master, of course, Mullah Badakhshi. In his poetry, you have the influence of Mullah Badakhshi. So yeah, I mean, in fact, the first book that he writes on Majmul Bahrain, on the common in fact features of India and Islam, or Hinduism and Islam. It begins with this famous line, which is Dara Shukoh's: "Kufro Islam dar rahash puya wahdahu la sharika lahu guya." The unbelief, infidelity, and Islam both are in fact running and to find out the truth, and both in fact are singing the song of Wahdahu la sharika lahu, because he believed that in India, primarily Indian religion is the religion of Tawheed, religion of Muwahhid. They are in fact monotheist. The idol worship is just in fact a part of manifestations of that monotheism, because everybody cannot afford to become really pure monotheists. So both in fact Indian traditions, Hinduism and Islam. So that is one. And the second, in fact, that is very interesting, and I think that I enjoy this Musalman, and this was one of the reasons that he became execution bill by the mullahs. Of course, the ulama did not approve of it. Musalman gar badanisti ke but cheest, badanisti ke di dar but paristis. If the Muslims would have known what is but parasti, what is idol worship,
Idolatry.
Idolatry, then they would have seen the truth, the religion in idolatry. So that is, and he himself, in fact, he writes to one of the Sufis when he in the beginning of Hasanatul Arifin, perhaps one of his texts, which he wrote early 1651 or 52, Kufr Haqiqi. He appropriated Kufr Haqiqi, the real infidelity, and he gave up Islam and Majazi. This is not something new in the Indo-Persian tradition. In fact,
because we see this in Rumi, for instance, right?
Rumi, of course, and later on, even in the 18th century, Mir Taqi Mir says, "Dino kya pucho, Dino mazhab ko." What are you asking Mir about his deen and mazhab? Kufr kashka lagaya, dair mein baitha. He, in fact, applied this tika on his forehead, and he sat in the temple. Kab ka tarak Islam kiya. Long time back, he gave up Islam. But of course, nobody says that, Mir said something kufr, and therefore he should not be buried and he should be beheaded. But Dara Shukoh, of course, was a prince, and, around the Basha, there were many, in fact, ulama, there were many people who expected something from, and there were also the visions of Mughal Empire. So Dara Shukoh, of course. So I would say that Dara Shukoh, in one sense, of course, he was drawn into his own world, and he was a real Sufi. He would not be concerned about what would be the impact. But whatever he said, in fact, it is true even today, and it should have to be. As in fact, I think perhaps Kalika Ranjan said that if you think of the real peace anywhere, then you have to start, with Dara.
With Dara Shukoh, exactly.
That
in the interest of time, we will not dwell too much about the tragic fate of Dara Shukoh, because as we all know, when the War of Succession began, there were two significant battles. One, the Battle of Samugar, and then the Battle of Deorai. At both these encounters, Dara Shukoh was soundly defeated, and thereafter he became a fugitive in his own empire. And then a series of betrayals followed through his flight, and he was eventually betrayed by Malik Jivan. He was brought to Delhi, incarcerated at the fort of Salimgarh, and executed under Aurangzeb's orders. We'll go on to the abiding legacy of Dara Shukoh. What does his legacy mean in today's times?
I would repeat, in fact, the same as Kalika Ranjan, and as you also have indicated in your book, that today, in fact, Dara Shukoh is as important as he was in Mughal India. I won't say more important as he was in Mughal India. That is a sincere effort to understand, to live together, of course, and to understand each other's living patterns, belief practices, and to have respect for each other. Even if you do not believe that it is the same, which Dara, of course, said on the basis of his research. You can debate, you can dispute his research. He may or may not have been correct, but at least the message is that you should try to understand, and that the others are also in search of truth, and the main message is that you should live together peacefully. That is sulh kul. He gave the real meaning, in fact, expanded meaning of the word sulh kul, peace with all. So that is what his legacy, or his
And how would you compare him with Akbar? Because this is something that everybody draws this comparison.
As I told you, that he's ahead of Akbar. He of course he takes ahead of Akbar's tradition, but he's ahead of Akbar. Akbar, as I told you, that Akbar, of course, showed interest in Indic traditions, and one of the major, in fact, the major book Mahabharata was translated, and also several others. But Akbar never thought that the Indic pattern of governance could be the model for Mughal governance. Akbar thought of in terms of Greco-Hellenic tradition maximum. Babur thought in terms of Greco-Hellenic. And Jahangir also tried to understand the European, the Western, and he showed keenness in his conversation with Jerome Xavier. But he never, in fact, and he translated, of course, under his supervision. In fact, the first major translation is of Yoga Vasishta. But Yoga Vasishta as a book of Sufism, as a book Vedanta, as a book of discovering the world inside. But here Dara Shukoh is who shows you that the book is also which helps you to see how the world could be managed by a ruler. So in this respect, perhaps I would think that there is nothing like ahead of, but naturally he is ahead of time. He is 100 years after Akbar, and he is after so much of experience of Mughal Empire. So he should be ahead of time. So this is how I would think. And yes, so one thing more which I want. Yes, so I think unless there are questions,
there are actually quite a few questions. Let's have Ranaji's question first. So, which talks about the Naqshbandi influence. So, I think Ranaji's question is: was there a Naqshbandi influence on Aurangzeb?
This is a good question, and I would be very brief. In fact, I have written something, and which will come out soon. It's not Naqshbandi's influence of Aurangzeb. I would say Aurangzeb's influence of
Naqshbandi.
He is so stubborn, and he is so much, in fact, obstinate, and he believes that what he thought and what he does, what he did, was the only representation of truth, that he would not listen to anybody, but he would be close to the people whom he thought he can use for the expansion of his power. So my understanding is, of course, Aurangzeb is very close, in fact, very close to, in fact, many of the, if not many, at least the main representative of the Sirhindi Mujaddidi Naqshbandi traditions is almost regularly at the court. And this comes out very well, in fact, in a funny way, of course, in the famous poet of Aurangzeb's time, which is, of course, Waqai Nemat Khan Ali, Danishmand Khan, Nemat Khan Ali's this Waqai Nemat Khan Ali, which gives you the account of Golconda siege, that how Aurangzeb is under the influence of Khwaja Muhammad Naqshband. Khwaja Muhammad Naqshband is there. In fact, he relates the dream of Khwaja Muhammad Naqshband, where, in fact, he gets what the nobles want, that the siege should be, in fact, the siege of Golconda they would not approve of, because the Muslims are being killed on both sides. But Aurangzeb would persist on the advice of perhaps Khwaja Muhammad Naqshband, because according to the Naqshbandi tradition, the Shias are outside the orbit of Islam. And according to Aurangzeb also, much before he came under the influence of Naqshbandi, even in his letters to Shah Jahan from the Deccan, that he writes as a viceroy of the Deccan, he shows that how Golconda ruler, in fact, being a Shia, has done something which violates the basic tenets of Islam. So I would not say that he is being influenced. I would say that he is influencing and he's using, but he certainly has very close contact. Very close contact. There is no doubt about it. We have evidence from the hagiographical, literature, that is from Naqshbandi letters, etc., and also from the political chronicles like Masir Alamgiri, and of course, as I told you, Nemat Khan Ali, and several others. In fact, Miratul Alam, Bakhtawar Khan's Miratul Alam.
Indeed. We have another question from Anitesh. Let's put that up. Okay, and I'll just read it out for you, Professor Alam. So he's saying that while the historical context provides us with an idea about how and why Dara Shukoh was pushed to the margins of history, why do you think Dara Shukoh has not been highlighted in in historical accounts?
Oh yes, there are two. In fact, it's a difficult question, but I think that because of Aurangzeb died in 1707. And Aurangzeb, of course, would never like Dara Shukoh's name even to be mentioned. And even in the poets' accounts of Dara Shukoh's time, Dara Shukoh is represented as the persons around whom Majazibo Majaneen had assembled. The mad people and those Majzub, those who had Qalandars, only they would be around Dara Shukoh. Whose in fact understanding of Islam is always open to question. So this is one. And in fact, because of Aurangzeb's being very close to the Naqshbandis, or because of the Naqshbandis having enjoyed the patronage of the emperor so much, you have in the 18th century fairly powerful, I would say fairly powerful influence in Delhi society. In fact, many of the texts, in fact, come from the Delhi society. You have one or two, three Beheshti's account, and also Shah Shujai. You can have the gleans of, but an account and true, in fact, true assessment, true evaluation of Dara Shukoh would be resisted throughout the 18th century. It's the period of, Shah Waliullah. I mean, I'm not suggesting that Shah Waliullah is against or for, but there is a different world in the 18th century, and the Naqshbandi, in the Naqshbandi family, there were also 2-3 important poets. One of them was very close to Mazhar Khan, Mazhar Jan Jana. Mazhar Jan Jana himself is a Naqshbandi Mujaddidi saint. So you can imagine. So for over 100 years after the death of Aurangzeb, it's only in the 19th century that the people, and after they had experienced what the East India Company regime is, and after they had noticed that the Europeans, in fact, now are in fact emulating Dara Shukoh's achievement. The Indian sciences, Indian knowledge is being exported to, is being appreciated to through that, like of course, first. Introduction of Mahabharata is through the Persian translation of Mahabharata. First introduction of Upanishad is through the translation of Dara Shukoh's Upanishad. So I think, it is in this context that Dara Shukoh comes back to. But that is, of course, too late. And yeah, so this is what I would respond for the moment.
Right.
I wonder if
we have another question that we take, and maybe we'll close with this one.
Yes, please.
So this is around the meditative practices. It's a question from Shikha, and she's asking about the Qadri tradition, because I think, if correct me if I'm wrong, in the Risala-i-Haqnuma there is a passage where he actually talks about the meditation of the Qadris, and it sounds very, very similar to the ancient Indic or Hindu tradition of the pranayam, for example.
Yes.
So I think the question is around the techniques of meditation that Dara would have practiced or the Qadri Sufis would have practiced.
Yes. Yeah, yes. That is, of course, that's not simply in Qadri Sufi. That is called Sultanul Azkar. The influence of when Dara is writing, in fact, Risale Haqnoma, he does not, in fact, show that he is already familiar with Indic traditions of yoga, but it comes out later on. Of course, it comes out very clearly that he has read, in fact, Indic texts so closely. But he discusses Sultanul Askar, but Sultanul Askar is not simply not peculiar to Qadri Silsila. In fact, in the 18th century, when you come to Chishti Saint Shah Kalimullah Jahanabadi, and if you read his letters, you have, in fact, several letters where you have the direct influence of yoga, and not simply his letters, but also his text, particularly Kashkol. There is one text which is called Kashkol. There are several, in fact. All these, in fact, are available in Urdu translation. In fact, a long time back, one of the Delhiwalas, he came, of course, from Saharanpur, Deoband. His name is Mustahsan Faruqi. He looked after the tomb of Shah Kalimullah Jahanabadi, and he also had a particular magazine, Astane, and he, in fact, he arranged several translations of these texts. If you go through these texts, in fact, much more influence of yoga. And Hatha Yoga influence is much earlier, in fact, from Bengal. That's Bahrul Hayat or something, Hazul Hayat, Bahrul Hayat, much earlier. And there's no Qadri connection. Qadris came, of course, around the Mughal times. So I think that, these interactions and dialogue between the Indic Sufi practices, Indic Vedantic practices or yoga practices and Sufis had all been there, in fact. So, but of course, it is there in the Risale Haqnuma. You are right. And he particularly mentioned, and this particular method of litanics practice is called Sultanul Azkar. That is the king of the litanics. The king of the litanics, yeah.
Indeed. There's one question in conclusion that I cannot resist asking, because I was looking at the chat box and quite a few of the viewers have also asked this. If Aurangzeb, for some reason, so some stratagem, had not ascended the throne, the Mughal throne, and it was Dara Shukoh instead who had ascended the Mughal throne, how would things have played out? How would history have played out?
Very briefly, I would have been the happiest person. But yes, I think that, earlier I used to, in fact, resist such questions. But I think that this is a very relevant question. It's a relevant question. If Dara Shukoh had come to power, at least one thing would not have happened, which in fact alienated practically, even if the manifestation of alienation is not in Aurangzeb's time. But if you come to the 18th century discussions and the Hindu texts, including the Marathas, you would notice that is, jizya would not have been reimposed. Besides, of course, several religious administrative measures which Aurangzeb took immediately after the death of his father. And so long as his father was alive, he did not, in fact, go totally to the fiqh side. And maybe that under Dara Shukoh also a book like Fatawa Alamgiri could have been compiled, but that was hardly implemented. Of course, this is a kind of intellectual pursuit. But, this reimposition of jizya, and you can imagine that jizya, the way that Raja Jai Singh finally in the 18th century makes appeal to the Mughal Badshah, Muhammad Shah, that why jizya should be abolished finally, shows that how much it hurt even those nobles or Hindu nobles who were still fighting for the Mughals.
Particularly those, because for generations they had been, wafadas, the mulazims of the Mughal Empire, and they would put, in fact, the interests of the Badshah before their own. So it was doubly hurtful for them.
And if there were no reimposition of jizya, what would have happened? Then, of course, it's the question of ifs and buts. I cannot tell you. Even after the no jizya, there could have been, quote unquote, what in fact many Muslim historians today write, Pakistani historians, Hindu assertion, Hindu reassertion of power. Even Shivaji, in fact, represented the Hindu Pad Pasha, Hindu in the sense as we use the term Hindu today. So that would have happened or would not have happened. Partition would have taken place or would not have taken place. In Mughal India, at least, this humiliating tax for the non-Muslims who were fighting for the Mughals, this was juristically unjustified. You cannot impose jizya on the people who are fighting with you for the defense and safety of your empire, your power. So that would have happened. This is one. And secondly, of course, people would have had freedom to think aloud. Aurangzeb, I will just give you, in fact, take 2 minutes more. Aurangzeb, in fact, because Dara Shukoh had become very friendly with Mullah or with Shah Muhibullah Ilahabadi. He was a great Chishti Sabri Sufi. And when he became, in fact, and you have still today, in fact, a mosque, still it is there in the vicinity of, in the precincts of his Khanqa, Shah Muhibullah Ilahabadi. Muhibullah Ilahabadi, yes, I think his name is Muhibullah. Yeah. So that mosque, Dara Shukoh Mosque, and it is called Daraganj today. It is called Daraganj. Now, he wrote a risala which is called Tasviya. In Tasviya, again, it's the discussion of Wahdatul Wujud and the similarity between all religions, and there is no truth. Truth is not confined to any particular, something like that. And this is in the light of Quran, because Quran says that in each community, God sent a prophet, and the prophet spoke the language of the community. Prophet did not speak Arabic. Prophet spoke Sanskrit in India, and prophet spoke Jewish, in fact, in pre-Abrahamic or pre-Muhammad times, and prophet would have spoken also in some other languages. So it is quite in keeping with the tradition. So he wanted all copies of the Tasviyah to be burnt in public. So, and he wrote to one of his disciples who was in the Mughal service, Sayyid Muhammad Qannuji, that I have heard that you have this text. So he said, I have a text, but I don't have enough fire to burn it. And in the imperial house, in the palace, there is enough fire. So if you want to burn it, you burn it. So that is, but one thing which I would like, in fact, to end with is that this is very significant, very important, that throughout his letters in Adab-e-Alamgiri, whatever the letters are available in Adab-e-Alamgiri of Aurangzeb, or even Raqaim Crime, nowhere Aurangzeb accuses Dara of having given up Islam. Nowhere he says that he is a mulhid. Of course, in his letter to Rana of Mewar, he writes that Dara become mulhid, and thoroughly interprets it, mulhid in the sense of political mulhid, that he had given up the Mughal tradition. And Dara Shukoh, in fact, Aurangzeb there, in fact, demonstrates his support for the Mughal policy of peace with all. In fact, this is very, in fact, very, very diplomatic, ironic, very clever letter. So nowhere, it is only after Dara Shukoh had been captured that the discussion comes about Dara Shukoh. Earlier, of course, ulama could have said something. I haven't read, of course, all the text of the time. But it is only after that Aurangzeb, and it is only after that Aurangzeb does not want Dara Shukoh's name to be. So it is a part of the Mughal tradition. That is, nobody, in fact, Shah Jahan also did not want Dawar Bakhsh or Shahriyar or all. There was bloodshed. In fact, his own Asaf Khan, in fact, had committed this bloodshed. There was no battlefield.
Engineered that on his behalf.
This is something to be considered. Why it is that Aurangzeb does not complain about Dara Shukoh's irreligiosity or his love for infidelity or his giving up of Islam in his letters to Jahanara? That's my question to all those, in fact, my friends who write so much, including my friends, of course. I have friends here and also in Pakistan. So why it is not so? How can you say? Where is the proof? Where is the proof in any one of his writings? In any one of his writings, Dara Shukoh's writing, that he gave up Islam. The only thing is that Dara Shukoh Of course, he's busy in his own world. That's true, that he is busy in his own inner world. And that is, of course, that is his weakness, or that could be his strength. I think that this could be his strength. It's a question of interpretation today from hindsight, since he failed. So this proved to be, this you can say it was his weakness. If he had succeeded, we would have said that, oh, he was a great ruler of his time. And so thank you very much.
Indeed. Professor Alam, this has been an absolutely fascinating, engrossing conversation. I, for one, have learned a lot during this program, and I'm sure so have the viewers. In fact, I'm tempted to do a little improvisation on Mirza Ghalib's शेर. है और भी दुनिया में तारीख वर बहुत अच्छे, कहते हैं आलम का है अंदाज़े बयां और.
Oh, so nice. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm humble, and I feel humbled. Of course, I'm just.
Thank you so very much for being with us. And viewers, we'll be back again on the 21st of November. Until then, stay safe. Thank you and goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.